So thank you. It is wonderful to be back here in our final event of the series on this winter evening, although it doesn't feel very wintry, I have to say. The theme of this series is the enduring enigma of the mind, and it seems to me one of the biggest mysteries is that we humans are so smart in so many ways. We can build electric cars and write novels and discover subatomic particles, but so often we don't seem to be very happy as we go through daily life. I mean, if you were to keep a ledger of how you're feeling on an average day, and on one side you added up all the minutes that you were feeling good, happy, creative, confident, loved, fulfilled, grateful, firing on all cylinders, and on the other side you tabulated all the minutes that you were feeling kind of crummy, anxious, worried, cranky, depressed, bored, frustrated, angry, feeling unappreciated, wishing you were doing something else, ruminating about all the stuff that didn't go right. How would that ledger work out for you? Do you think you'd be happy 80% of the time, 50%, or less? I mean, we are a super smart species with big brains, and yet so often we don't seem to be doing that well, and the question is why? And what can we do? Not just to be happier, but to lead what we would call a good life or a virtuous life. Of course, this is a profound question that philosophers throughout the ages have been debating, and more recently that psychologists and neuroscientists have been trying to understand, to discover more about both our cognitive capacities and also our emotions. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. We have a lot to talk about, and we have a wonderful panel to do it, so let me introduce our speakers. Richard Davidson is a professor of psychology and psychiatry and founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research is focused on the neural bases of emotion and methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and other contemplative practices. He's the author with Sharon Bagley of The Emotional Life of Your Brain and co-author with Daniel Goleman of Altered Traits. Edith Hall is a professor of classics and ancient history at Durham University in England. Her specialty is ancient Greek literature, and she's written widely on other aspects of ancient Greek and Roman history and culture, including Greek theater, ethnicity, slavery, and gender. Her books include Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life, and Inventing the Barbarian, Greek Self-Definition Through Tragedy. Dacher Keltner is a professor of psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and founding director of the Greater Good Science Center. His research focuses on the biological and cultural evolution of compassion, love, beauty, and humility. His books include Born to be Good, The Science of a Meaningful Life, and Awe, The New Science of Everyday Wonder and How It Can Transform Your Life. And he was also the scientific consultant for the Pixar movies Inside Out and Soul. So welcome, all of you. So, happiness is a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, both among all those self-help books and also by scholars. There is sort of this new budding scholarly discipline of happiness. So, Dacher, I'm going to start with you. What is happiness?
I will start with the easy question, huh? Yeah. And it's wonderful to have a classicist on hand. Happiness is a question that cultures have been grappling with for millennia. It's one of the deepest questions we ask about people. And in the scientific literature, which has exploded in the past 30, 40 years, we tend to define happiness as just feeling good about life. And that tells us a lot about the state of your body, the state of your relationships. You can break it down, as you probably would, into subdomains, right, or domains of happiness. And these prove to be very important, like the positive emotions you feel on a regular basis, your relationships, your sense of agency in the world, how you handle stress, and then meaning is a very hot topic right now in terms of the narratives that you provide for all kinds of experiences and the story that you tell about your life. And what I'd note, that's how we approach it from a Western scientific perspective. You're probably already noting limitations to that, that we don't talk about virtue as explicitly in the literature. So I'm eager to hear what Edith has to say. She's raising her eyebrows in a non-virtuous way. And then the environment, and indigenous scholars like Urias Salidin, who's here, we don't talk about the human relationship to the environment in our scientific literature. So that's how we define it scientifically now from a Western perspective, and there's a lot of progress to make.
So, Richie, is happiness the same thing as well-being?
No. It's not. We know that there are people who I think we would all consider to be individuals who have high levels of well-being, but if they are exposed to a tragedy, if there's a tragic loss, if they're told about a really deeply sad event, it would be really inappropriate for them to be happy at that moment. And so it is possible to, I think, maintain high levels of well-being in the face of adversity, and that is not always accompanied by happiness. And so I think that happiness is sometimes used as a placeholder for other qualities that are related to happiness but are really not identical.
So what would be some of the qualities, some of the elements of well-being?
So some of the elements of well-being are a fundamental sense of okayedness. So that's one element. A second element is a deep sense of connection to our environment, to our context, to others around us, and particularly to our connectedness socially. And we have also, in our own work, formulated a template, a typology for understanding the core constituents of well-being, which are really different than happiness. They include meaning and purpose, something that Dacher mentioned, but they also include elements that are not typically included in most Western conceptions of well-being, in part because this framework that we've developed is informed by both modern science and by the contemplative traditions, which are particularly interested in how we can nurture well-being.
So, Edith, you are the classicist on our panel here, and you are especially a specialist on the ancient Greek philosophers. What did they say about happiness?
It's one of the biggest questions in ancient Greek thought. It's there before the philosophers. It's already in Homer. Achilles wonders what is going to be the best way to feel fulfilled. But Aristotle is the absolute founding father of so many things, from zoology to physics to aesthetics, but he is also the founding father of happiness studies, without a doubt. It is the major question in his major book. He's the first person to write a book just about ethics that doesn't include politics in it, like Plato's Republic, and his Nicomachean Ethics. The absolutely overriding question is, how can I as an individual be happy?
Because I don't think of ethics and happiness as necessarily the same thing.
Well, they are if you're Aristotle, but his answer is that it's actually, he doesn't say this, but this is what every single word amounts to, is that it's not a noun, it's a verb. It's not a state, it's not an abstract condition, it's not something you can achieve and bag forever. It's something you do in every minute of your life, in engagement with other people, and in all your decisions, and in all your planning, and you make it continuously in an active way. It is an active thing that you do. It is not a passive state that you arrive at. So it's down to you. You can make it. You can make your own happiness. He didn't distinguish between happiness and well-being, as you so eloquently have, and I'm inclined to agree with you, because the trouble is that his word for happiness, which is eudaimonia, has been translated every which way.
Isn't the translation often something like flourishing?
I think flourishing is probably the best, and it's also to flourish. That, for me, has that active agency in it. If you want an abstract noun, the one I prefer is felicity, which was what the Roman philosophers translated eudaimonia as. And felicity, the state of being Felix, also implies nothing to do with transient physical pleasures, nothing to do with wealth and property, except that having no wealth at all, if you're poor, you cannot do this because your verb is getting the next meal. It's not thinking about how to feel happy. But the answer in the, we can get onto this, the answer in the Nicomachean Ethics is it's a way of life that you practice in all your relationships, all your decisions, that is in accordance with virtue. And this saved my life pretty much when I was 23, because I had lapsed from Christianity at 13. I was brought up in a very strict Protestant family. And for my entire young adulthood, could not see that there was any connection between being a good person and a happy person. Capitalism was telling me to be really nasty and beat everybody else, right? To compete, right? There's something really odd about the value system. So I tried being really horrible for 7 years. I did. And just be out for myself, because that's what society was saying. I was absolutely miserable. And then I read Aristotle as an undergraduate at Oxford, and he did convince me that you had a better chance of a happy life if you started doing things in a way that were good.
Well, and that's a really interesting point, and something that we should dig into here, which is, I mean, I think we tend to think of happiness as just something internal. You know, it's we feel good about ourselves, or, you know, maybe translated as hedonism in some way. But you all are all talking about a broader definition of happiness that has a social component too. Dacher?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the limitations of how we've defined it in the West. Yeah. And, you know, you go back to the Age of Enlightenment, and utilitarian theory it's about the greater good, right? It's about how your actions affect the network of people you're connected to. And that would probably be a more robust and sensible assessment of a person's happiness, is the effects upon the people they're connected to. And that changes the whole calculus of how we think about the phenomenon, right? So, and it's more of a socially distributed state, if you will, that has action in it and intention.
But maybe we're trying to do too much with that word. I mean, maybe happiness is really more limited. It's just about how we're feeling ourselves, and maybe we need different words to talk about doing good in the world.
Well, whatever the word is that we ultimately choose to use, whether it's eudaimonia or felicity — I love felicity, actually. What we're, I think, really aiming toward is, first of all, it's not a state, because states are transient.
Exactly.
And this is actually why Dan Goleman and I wrote the book Altered Traits, which is a play on altered states, because what we're really interested in is enduring transformation. We're not interested in transient states that occur and then a person comes back down to her or his baseline. The second thing that I think is really important is, one of the insights that we glean from modern neuroscience is that there are two fundamentally different forms of learning. One we call declarative learning, which is learning about stuff. So you can learn the value of well-being or the value of flourishing, but that won't necessarily help, or it might help, but it won't be sufficient to enable you to embody those qualities. There's a second form of learning that we call procedural learning, which is practice-based, it's skill-based, it is active, it's a verb, it is a skill, it is something we also know is instantiated in completely different neural networks than declarative learning. And we need both in order to really realize felicity or eudaimonia.
So in other words, if happiness is a skill, or at least this version of it, we can learn it? I mean, and you can teach it too?
Unquestionably. I mean, I would say the scientific data is incontrovertible on that point.
Okay. How? I know all of you are dealing with this question, but Dacher, how do you teach people to be happy?
You're always giving me the easy ones, Steve. Thanks. Yeah, you know, I mean, there's a really important new science, intervention science, if you will, of giving people different kinds of practices to cultivate well-being or happiness, you know, with rigorous controls. I tend to put it into 3 different bins, if you will. One is cultivate dynamic states of being, like awe or compassion, and that'll get you there. Another is to think about the social tendencies that you can amplify. Can you practice gratitude? There's cool work on striking up really nice conversations with strangers, right, as bringing you happiness or forgiveness. And a third is handling hardship through, meaning and meditation and narrative writing and the like. So there's a lot of progress being made on really shifting people out of hard conditions to a better life. And so you can teach it.
Edith, how did the ancient Greeks think you could learn to be happier?
Well, again, I seem to be separating Aristotle off from the rest of the ancient Greeks because he really was such a revolutionary and radical thinker on these things. I was nodding so hard because what you're talking about with the second type, the second's procedural, it's phronesis, it's practical wisdom. It's what you have acquired, the learning that you've laid down and the hard wires that you have been hardwiring all your life. And Aristotle is quite clear that you can habituate yourself to behave in ways if you start consciously and then it becomes unconscious. This is one of the biggest things, it's habit. And that, to me, you don't drive geared cars, but we drive geared cars in England. And when you first start learning to drive, you have to think every time, shall I go into third, shall I go into fourth, whatever. I never think now about changing gear because I've done it so often. So Aristotle, first thing is that you actually have to do, and this is actually in another book called the Eudaimon Ethics, but he actually gives you a questionnaire on your behavior, which you have to tick, and you have to be completely honest, because if you're not honest, it won't work, and then you won't get to be happy. But you have to go through all the things that you do, like, do you do things that are vindictive? Do you do things that are angry? Do you do things that are mean with money or generous with money? And you decide, you find out, you really stare yourself in the face and decide which ones you need to work on, which ones you want to maximize, like you need to be better at smiling, which ones you want to minimize. In my case, it was very much revenge. I love revenge. I've had to work so hard on being vindictive. But then you put it into practice, and eventually you don't have to think about it. Eventually you have accustomed yourself to not turning the other cheek, but sort of walking away or whatever. And my own habit thing that I found I always come back to in my own head is that I had these rather grim 50s parents. They weren't bad people at all, but they never smiled when you approached them. We were all terrified of approaching them because it would be, what do you want if you were lucky? Seriously, they did not smile. So when I had my own kids, I made this very, very conscious decision. It was, hello, darling, what can I do for you? To the extent that my kids do this as an impersonation, as a party trick. Like. And
let me actually follow up on that. So
but now I do it without, right, I can remember when they were tiny, and it would be like, please, what you actually want to say, would you F off and watch TV so I can have my gin and tonic, right? But instead of you switch off the radio, hello, darling. But I actually did start doing that automatically after about 2 or 3 years. And that, for me, is the most important example.
So smiling is a very physical act.
Yeah.
And, we tend to think of happiness as more of a mental state, but there's a bodily response here,
yeah,
right?
There is.
And doesn't the science back that up, Richie?
Yeah, well, there's definitely good science to show that there are facial signs as well as other bodily expressions of these qualities. These qualities are embodied qualities.
Yeah.
And so they are an integrated package. And it's, the flip side is also important to note. Negative qualities like loneliness, for example, is not simply a subjective state, but some of you may not know, but loneliness is actually more than twofold the risk factor compared to obesity for mortality.
For death, yeah.
For mortality.
Yeah.
So it gets under the skin. So these are all embodied qualities that represent changes that occur in the brain and the body in an important and integrated way. There are facial signs, but there are also many other signs in the body that have important implications for physical health. And it also raises the question, which I'll put on the table. There is a growing scientific literature that suggests that people who report higher levels of well-being are physically healthier. It doesn't mean that it's true for everyone, but if you look at large epidemiological data, that is the case. And this is another example of how these qualities are indeed embodied qualities.
When you say physically healthier, they live longer, they have fewer illnesses, what is it?
They live longer, they have biomarkers which are indicative of improved health. There's a study which came out not too long ago looking across nations at 151 countries throughout the world, looking at the average level of well-being from survey data and looking at the life expectancy in those countries. Across 151 countries, there's a 0.71 correlation between the well-being of the nation and life expectancy. So this stuff matters.
Yeah, and I love the conversation around embodiment. It's a really active area of cognitive science right now that, you know, the concepts in our minds, like I feel happier, connected, really trace back into bodily systems in very ancient and systematic ways. You know, our sense of threat, financial threat tracks activation in the stress response in your heart, really in a precise way. But that really opens us up to other things to think about with respect to happiness, about how we hold our bodies, what the yogic traditions do, right? This very sophisticated practice of moving your body in different ways, the rituals you might find in a religious practice, a bodily response. Even just deep breathing has pretty clear effects on physiological systems that are good for health and happiness. And we, in this kind of conversation, we often forget the body, except you've brought it back to our attention with this weird smile that you've inflicted upon your children. But, you know, it's important to keep the body as part of our conversation.
Exactly, yeah.
What did Aristotle have to say about the body?
Well, interestingly, and we could perhaps get onto the cognitive element of happiness through this, he is called a peripatetic for a reason. And that is, the peripatetic school, is that they walked while they did their dialogues together. And the walking rhythm, he actually says, with the pace, you got into a rhythm where you'd ask the question and the other people, and so this sort of went along with this sort of heart rate thing. And he was a great walker. He strode I've been to all 8 places he lived in and imagined. But I also do my best thinking, actually, walking the dog. Now, admittedly, the dog doesn't always answer me when I say things to him like, what do you think about the problem of suffering? You know, but he's there, but this is important because the first sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics, he says that asking how I can be human is a human thing. It's one of about 5 major things that distinguishes them even from other higher animals. Right?
Well, why do you think...
Sorry, in the first sentence, he says, all humans, not men, all humans by nature desire to know. And if you stop people being able to expand their minds, if you deprive them, if you put them in a cell, in one of the reasons why putting people in solitary confinement without any books or anything is so cruel is that there is no new data to process. There is no new data that you can. You also can't go striding around. But I see this sort of person moving around, looking around, and wonder who is doing the Orr book. The Orr book, that goes precisely like wondering at the universe and thinking about it and consciously interacting with it. But I feel that's very embodied. And I've been very interested in studies of blind people who can do just as well with sufficient podcasts and oral stimulation.
Can I just follow up on the walking? Why? Because I've heard that so often, and I've had that experience too, that, you know, if I walk, I often, I don't know, somehow think better and just feel good. Why? Why is walking so good for us? I mean, just not just physically, because, you know, we're in better shape, but emotionally.
Well, first of all, there's a growing scientific literature on the relationship between movement and cognition.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, for example, when kids first learn math, they often are moving. They move their fingers, and it turns out that those movements are important
Fascinating.
in the actual learning process. So that's one issue. A second, really different issue is the relationship between aerobic exercise or aerobic movement and thinking or cognition. And we know that the most empirically well-validated strategy, non-pharmacological strategy for increasing human neuroplasticity is aerobic exercise. The data are really strong and very extensive. The thing is, increasing plasticity in and of itself is neutral. If you fill your mind with unwholesome thoughts, for example, when you are engaging in exercise, that will actually help to consolidate those unwholesome negative thoughts. If you are, on the other hand, experiencing wholesome qualities, virtuous qualities, and at the same time you're walking or doing other kinds of exercise, this is a hypothesis, but all of the evidence suggests that it would actually lead to improvements in the consolidation of those qualities. There's a whole new field of contemplative aerobics that has not yet been developed, but this is really a serious and important issue deserving of scientific attention.
Dacher, you have just written a book on awe, and one of your rather bold statements at the beginning of the book is that you say if you want to boil down, the secrets of happiness, it comes down to awe. And maybe you should tell us what awe is first.
And forgive me for making that rather bold statement. You got to sell books, so yeah. Awe is this incredible emotion that had been ignored by scientists because the last thing you want to be thought of is, somebody from California and Berkeley who's studying awe sitting in their hot tub or whatever it is, which is not true. But awe is the emotion we feel, a mental state when we encounter vast mysteries. And it's about music and nature and the extraordinary kindness that is all around us. And then things from culture like music and visual design and big ideas and life and death. And it does have this special place in happiness, this field, in terms of helping us figure out the big point of life and meaning, right? Awe is like a compass to what we really care about. And it's an interesting thought experiment. If I asked all of you, tell me about a time in which you started to tear up and get the chills at a piece of music, how many of you would recall something like that, right? It's a deep human universal. And then within that is this sense of that music tells me what I care about in life, right? Be it, some form of beauty or social justice in hip-hop music or what have you. So awe has this special relationship to meaning, which is important. And then just the new science of awe is it reduces stress, helps older people handle physical pain. We had an awe walk. You can do this later. There are awe walks all over the world right now where you go walk once a week and find awe, and we had them take pictures of themselves, and their self tended to vanish. And it really, the brief moments of awe help your heart, they help your immune system, less stress, and a better sense of community. And that's really striking to me because, we get awe in nature. You can go to Central Park and maybe see the emergence of spring, and you feel awe, and suddenly you feel like you have better community, which is how powerful this emotion is. So it's a good one to go cultivate. And forgive me for the exaggeration, perhaps.
No, I'm delighted to hear that.
Yeah.
So we've been mostly talking about happiness and well-being as an emotional state, or whatever the verb of an emotional state would be. We haven't talked that much about reason or critical thinking. I mean, can you get yourself to happiness through rationality?
Well, you can when it comes to deliberation, decision making. I spoke a little earlier about Aristotle's five or six things. He starts with man is just an animal who likes to live in a community, which is what man is a political animal means. It doesn't mean he wants to go into party politics. It means we live in large communities with non-kin, right? He says that's really human. That's really odd. Hardly any other animals do that. They live with kin. Then there's humour. He thinks it's only humans. I think some zoologists would now disagree with that. But
Rats laugh, by the way.
rationality, and in particular, the ability to deliberate, is, he says, the absolute sign of what it is to be a Homo sapiens. And that's why he spends so many pages in the Nicomachean Ethics on how to take decisions. This is not what flavour of Cocoa Pops to have. This is the big one. This is the big life decision. It's an immensely complicated rational exercise with 8 fundamental steps in. And one of the most important is also involves the next human capacity, which is our relationship to time. So we can do something which is called deliberate recollection and calibrating of likelihoods in the future. And no other animal, we think, can do that. You cannot make decisions, he says, without both inquiring into all precedents. Shall we go to try to conquer Afghanistan? It might be possibly worth thinking about whether Napoleon or Alexander the Great had managed that, right? But also calibrate all likelihoods thinking into the future. That's a crucial part of this logos, this critical capacity. And I go around state schools talking to 16 to 18-year-olds constantly about how to make decisions. And I'm just overwhelmed with the response, the gratitude, the scribbling down. Nobody ever told me that before. And one very particular thing is, one of Aristotle's rules is consult a disinterested expert. Now, this is very good because it allows me to explain to kids the difference between disinterested and uninterested, which is very satisfying to me. But if you want to know whether to leave your boyfriend, the very worst person to talk to you is your girlfriend, because they have a huge vested interest in how much time is available of you. You go to a relationship counsellor or equivalent who has no vested. These really basic rules, and we can do that. And I don't think even dolphins or elephants do that.
So you've been talking about Aristotle, but
Sorry.
let me mention Socrates. I mean, supposedly he said the unexamined life is not worth living. Is he right?
Yes, and Socrates is Aristotle's professional grandfather. Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. For 20 years, Aristotle was at the academy, 17 to 37, okay. He only left because all the others were so envious of him because he was so much better and they didn't appoint him head when Plato died. A lot of us have been there. But absolutely, to examine the life, to constantly rake over what is it, why are we doing this? And that was in the very particular context of Athenian democracy, where there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of cliches going around, and Socrates would hold everybody up on all of them. It had a very political application. So no, Aristotle is not at all the first, but he is the first to say, as I said, write a book, which is basically, how do I become somebody who feels good about myself and others, which is my paraphrase for happiness.
So Richie, let me bring modern neuroscience into this.
Yeah.
I mean, we've, again, been talking mostly about emotion, but what about sort of this critical faculty in terms of our well-being? How important is that?
Well, let me actually begin to answer that first with just an example, not from modern neuroscience, but some of you may be surprised to learn that the kind of meditation that the Dalai Lama does on a regular basis every day, that is his principal form of meditation, is one that uses reason. It's actually based on reason. It requires thinking. It's called analytic meditation. There's been almost no scientific research that's been done on this, but it intentionally deploys reason in ways that are not dissimilar, I think, from Aristotle. And it is really about using reason to examine, for example, the nature of the self, and to examine the nature of reality. So specifically, is there intrinsic nature to the categories that we perceive? And this is really a very fundamental point in classical Buddhism. And in terms of science, first of all, there's a lot of parallel in our understanding of neuroscience and the kind of reason that's deployed in analytic meditation to discover the nature of reality. When we dream, we construct worlds in our mind and we have emotional reactions to them as if they were real. Well, folks, I hate to break the news, but that's actually true of waking life too. It's fundamentally no different. The world that we see, that we react to, is literally constructed by our minds and brains, and each individual will construct the world in her or his own specific way. And so there's a lot of convergence there in science, and the idea that we can use reason to help us to become more happy, and I'll just end here, there's a whole tradition of empirically validated work on cognitive therapy, which is one of the most empirically well-validated strategies for decreasing anxiety and depression and promoting well-being, that is fundamentally based on our capacity to reason about the causes of our behavior. And it explicitly uses reason. So I would say that reason is a big part. It sometimes gets knocked in these discussions, but I think it's appropriate for it to be elevated.
So some of what we've been talking about, well-being, peak experiences can be wonderful, they can be transcendent, they can also be fleeting, and they don't necessarily extend beyond ourselves. I mean, we might have this extraordinary experience, walking in the woods among the big trees or something like that, and then we go back to our normal lives, and okay, we're back to baseline, which wasn't so great. And it doesn't necessarily make a difference to those people around us. So I'm wondering, what does it take to take these states to make us better people? I guess my question is, when does happiness turn into virtue, into something more with an ethical component? Dacher?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one way to answer that question is to think about what dimensions of happiness are activated during the experience, and there's a lot of new science on what philosophers like Adam Smith and David Hume called, the moral sentiments, and they're very close to states of virtue, right? So gratitude is easy to cultivate. It's a kind of emotion that activates a lot of downstream benefits for people in terms of, sharing and cooperating. Compassion is another one that's been central to the contemplative traditions. It's very clearly has an emotional structure to it. You can activate it through contemplative exercises, engaging in service and the like, and that has a lot of benefits in sort of the calculus of virtue. So that's one angle at it, is to think about which states you go after to benefit the greater good.
And if I can just chime in and say that I think one element that's really important here is the element of practice and consistency. One of the things that I often remind myself of and others is when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And it's kind of remarkable. I'm sure every one of you brushes your teeth, and virtually everyone on the planet does it, and it's not something that's in our genome. We've actually learned to do this. And we do this because it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And what we're talking about are practices important for our personal mental hygiene. And I think most people would agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth. And so science shows that if we spend even as little time as we spend brushing our teeth each day, nourishing our mind, this world would really be a different place.
Can I say something? The rationality, to go back to the rationality slightly, I'd be very interested in what my scientific colleagues think about this. But so in all the ancient philosophical traditions which asked how should we be happy, which include things like Stoicism, Epicureanism, Platonism, cynicism, as well as peripatetic philosophy, the relationship between emotion and reason is one that is always discussed. And none of the other schools, only Aristotle, I think, adumbrates anything like modern consensus. All of them oppose, all the others oppose it. And I'm sorry if there's any neo-Stoics in the audience, but neo-Stoics really don't read the ancient Stoicism. But he's all about using your ratiocination to batter your emotions and instincts underground like whack-a-mole, right? Get down sex, get down anger, get down excitement, get down pleasure. You know, this is Plato, this is the Stoa. Aristotle says that's not it at all. What you've got to do is find a decision that sits okay with both your emotion and your reason. If it doesn't, it's not going to work. And he says, he's very brilliant at the analogies of a spoon. He says emotion and reason are the convex and concave sides of a spoon. And that's why he has this idea of the golden mean. So it's, very angry down to appropriately angry, and then no anger, then you can't be happy because you're not going to be a moral agent if you can't get at all angry. And he cites my favorite story on this in all of ancient literature, and I'm afraid we do it as a family. So Herodotus says the Persians, when they got to take a big decision together, either as a family or as a nation, all get drunk. Sorry, I shouldn't be saying this in a medical place. And take a vote drunk. Get their ids on, basically. Get their ids out. Then the next day, they all get sober and redo the same decision sober. And they only act if both votes go together. And I have to say that my family and I, at least my husband and I, have gone Persian. And it works. If you do something against the gut, whatever you scientists call the gut now, but your powerful emotional response to something, unless you're extremely unbalanced and really do need psychiatric help, you're in trouble. I'd be just interested to know what you think about that.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, you're suggesting, that example suggests that reason and emotion are in conflict and you somehow have to bring them together.
No, I think that reason is a set of arrangements we make cerebrally to suit what we want to do anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that's been a big shift in emotion science as well, and more broadly psychological. Yeah, that emotions for a long time have been critiqued. I think there's a gender bias in that.
Absolutely.
And
the body again.
Exactly. But careful study reveals even emotions that seem the most irrational, like anger, and that's always a tricky emotion for happiness in the contemplative world, have tons of information and rationality in them, that they are statements about this is unfair and unjust. Yeah. And in fact, with respect to our conversation, there's really nice work showing, the right kind of anger leads to effective social movements, effective justice protests. It leads to social change.
Right time, right place, right amount.
Right, and it's a very Aristotelian perspective. So I think, and Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, System 1, System 2, right? This deep layer of feeling and intuition is structuring rationality and what we think of and how we perceive the world. So it's a big shift in how we think about the mind.
But I think you have to if you feel very powerful anger, you need to think very, very hard about why,
right,
where it's come from, and it might be something to do with your childhood or whatever, which is where a good old psychotherapist will be very helpful. But then how best to channel it, how to make it effective. Yeah. So you've still got to use reason on your emotion, but not in a way that just silences it, as is in the whole Platonic, Stoic, and I'm afraid Christian tradition.
So, Richie, I have to ask you a question. In looking at
That's a lot to say.
And in looking at the contemplative world, right? This is a central reason people go to contemplative practices. It's like I've got all this storm in my mind of negative emotion. What are you learning about reason within contemplation?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things we're learning, which is very consistent with what you're describing, Edith, is it's really fundamentally maladaptive to fight with your mind. So trying to suppress emotion really is not a very useful strategy. So that's one thing. Second thing is looking at the example of someone like the Dalai Lama, who I've spent a lot of time around, as an exemplar of someone who has very high levels of well-being. I would also say that the Dalai Lama probably has the greatest dynamic range of emotion of any human being I've ever met.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is that he is very emotional. And if the kind of stereotype of meditation producing an emotional zombie is just directly contradicted by the demeanor of the Dalai Lama. His emotions are very, very pronounced. However, they only last as long as they need to last. So I've seen the Dalai Lama be angry, and then I've seen him 2 seconds later burst out laughing.
Wow.
And that is a quality which we often see in young infants, but it seems we lose that quality for the most part as adults. In the Dalai Lama, you see it just robustly all the time. And what I would say is that it is highly context-appropriate emotion. So it is displaying, expressing emotion which is appropriate for whatever the context, but then completely and utterly dropping it and letting it go. And that's unfortunately something that most people are not able to do, but that too is a learnable skill, and it's part of the skills of learning well-being or learning to flourish.
So I want to talk about the really hard stuff, pain, suffering, and how that figures into all of this. And again, going back to the ancient Greeks, I mean, when we think of Greek plays, we often think of the tragedies, and the tragedies revolve around suffering. Why was suffering so important to the Greek playwrights?
Well, because suffering is inherent in human life, and it's horrible. And absolutely nobody, pagan ancient Greek, ever said it was a good thing. Nobody says it's redemptive. No one says it helps you be a better person. Nobody says any of that religious stuff. They thought it was terrible, but inevitable. So what tragedy does is, a tragedy is an enactment of suffering. It can be psychological. In the case of Sophocles' Philoctetes, it's entirely physical. The guy is simply in agony, right, from a terrible gout, ulcerated leg. It can be bereavement. It can be social. It can be a woman who, like Medea, who is just being treated incredibly badly because she's a woman. So there's lots of different reasons why you can suffer. What tragedy does that other depictions of suffering don't, where you distinguish it, like snuff movies or gladiatorial combat to death, is ask why. And it asks, why is this suffering going on? Which is the fundamental question, as far as I'm concerned, of pretty much all philosophy. You know, whether it's Bertrand Russell, can't be Christian because of suffering. You know, why are we allowed to suffer? Why do we have 400 years of slavery? Why do we have the Holocaust? Why do people we all know are wonderful with little children die of cancer, right? But Greek tragedy does ask that, and it comes up with completely different questions, and I'll try to be quick, but they range 2 plays by Sophocles you might know, from Oedipus, random bad luck or uncontrollable bad luck, doomed before he was even born. There is nothing whatsoever he could do because he was going to kill his father and marry his mother. To Antigone, excuse me, some of you may know Sophocles' Antigone, where there is no religious reason whatsoever, there is no predetermination. King Creon is the lousiest leader in all of Greek literature, including Agamemnon in the Iliad. He's pretty grim, right? Creon is worse than Donald Trump, right? Well, perhaps not. He may not be worse than Vladimir Putin, but he makes 4 or 5 ridiculous, ill-judged mistakes because he doesn't deliberate properly, right? Which lead to the destruction of his entire family, okay? So that is all human error. every tragedy asks why. So that is why it's so incredibly important to me. By going to these plays, the ancient Athenians worked out which ones they could avoid and which ones they couldn't avoid, right? Simple as that. And about half of them could easily be avoided with a bit of decent decision-making, going to a shrink, going to a marriage guidance counsellor, appealing to the United Nations Court of Human Rights or something. So that's why it's so important. Aristotle was the first philosopher to write brilliantly on random bad luck. And he said it can sabotage the happiest man in the universe.
So I want to bring another ancient tradition that is also dealt very explicitly with suffering, and that's Buddhism. Richie, how do the Buddhists think about suffering? Is there any correlation here?
Yeah, I think there is some parallel. Of course, the Four Noble Truths are fundamental to Buddhism, and the first noble truth is that life is suffering. I often like to paraphrase the bumper sticker, stuff happens. Adversity is part of life. And from a scientific perspective, what becomes interesting is, and really important for well-being and flourishing, is how we recover from adversity, how we manage adversity, and we can harness the opportunities that we are given through adversity to learn certain skills that can be so critically important, not only in that situation, but going forward. One of the ways that we define resilience is literally resilience in a scientific framework can be defined as the rapidity with which you recover from adversity. People who recover quickly are more resilient. And that could be measured. We've measured it in many different ways, and it's a learnable skill.
How do you learn to be more resilient?
You learn to be more resilient by practicing 4 key elements of well-being. Awareness, which is really about knowing what your mind is doing. The second is through connection. These are skills of what is critical for healthy social relationships. The third, which may be especially important here, we call insight, which is a curiosity-driven awareness and understanding of the narrative that we all carry around about ourselves. So when we suffer, for example, when we're in pain, we often will say, I'm in pain. What does it mean to say that sentence? What does I am in pain actually mean? What is the I? Is it all of you that's in pain? Is it every cell in your body? Is it every nook and cranny of your mind? When you begin to investigate the nature of the I that is suffering, suffering becomes transformed.
And isn't compassion literally to suffer together? Isn't that the meaning of the word compassion?
Absolutely. Well, it's the feeling of concern for another person's suffering, and it's interesting when we get to these dimensions of happiness that are related to virtue and the good life. They often involve direct encounters with suffering, and I think there's a new vein of thinking that evolutionarily humans responded to threat and peril and suffering collectively. We do so in Greek, coming together to appreciate a Greek drama, but really interesting examples. Compassion is where you encounter the physical pain of another, and work by Richie and our lab shows it actually activates prosocial regions of your nervous system, like the vagus nerve. You want to assist. Our better angels come out through suffering. Gratitude, a lot of thinking suggests, comes out of food scarcity, right? That was a serious evolutionary peril in our history, and we developed these ways of sharing food and practicing gratitude to really bond together to handle that threat. And awe, very often people feel awe in encountering horrors, right? The horrors of war, of trauma, and the like. And again, it's this exemplified in theater, right? I will come together with others to grasp why this suffering is occurring. So it actually I worry about our kids, right? We keep them away from suffering. Yeah. We don't want them to contemplate what is inevitably part of life. Other cultures do a better job of it, and we may be kind of preventing them from these pathways to virtue.
You mentioned the vagus nerve.
I know.
Can you tell us what the vagus nerve does?
It's, Richie and I have been talking about the vagus nerve for decades. It's this amazing part of your body, and if I start getting wild-eyed, forgive me. It's part of your autonomic nervous system. Starts in the top of your spinal cord. It's the largest bundle of nerves in a mammalian nervous system. Gets into your throat and head. Helps you look at people in the eyes and vocalize. Slows your heart. Deepens your breathing. Regulates a lot of digestive organs. Projects into the gut. And it really, Steve Porges thought this is a part of our nervous system that emerged evolutionarily to help us engage with others, to be open to the world. And I think the data are aligning with that in large part, that it is part of compassion and pro-social emotion, which is interesting.
Richie, a lot of your work does focus on compassion. Is there more science to understanding what happens in acts of compassion?
Yeah, I think that one of the important scientific insights here is how compassion is distinguished from empathy, because they're often confused. And so when we empathize with another who is suffering, we take on their suffering. And research shows that we literally take it on, so that the areas in the brain that are activated when you are suffering or in pain are activated in the empathizer when they are empathically engaged with that person who is suffering. And as you might imagine, after that goes on cumulatively, it really can become toxic. And so when people in the helping professions talk about compassion burnout, I think what they're really talking about is empathy burnout and not compassion burnout. The neural changes that we see in compassion are totally different than what we see in empathy. And some of the networks in the brain that are associated with connection and care that Dacher was alluding to are activated during compassion. And also, and this is sort of apropos of Aristotle and our discussion of movement earlier, motor regions of the brain are activated during compassion. Action areas of the brain. And it is because compassion is a quality which is preparing us to act when suffering is encountered. So when we put our butt on the cushion and meditate on compassion, we're doing it to prepare ourselves for the encounter with suffering in everyday life. So we're more likely to spring into action spontaneously when suffering is encountered.
So this is really interesting. This is sort of an argument against empathy.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a famous psychologist by the name of Paul Bloom who wrote a book with basically that title, The Case Against Empathy, and largely for these reasons.
But empathy it's really interesting, is not an ancient Greek word. This is a coined one. Sympatheia, sympathy, is an ancient Greek word, and that's compassion, so that you feel sympathy in the positive way that you're talking. There is no word
That's so interesting.
for empathy. I got worried about this myself because I definitely I suffered as a child from such acute over-empathizing that I was totally crippled. And in fact, it's one of the reasons that I take SSRIs. That sounds terrible, but I don't cry every time I see anybody suffering. I really did as a child. I found it absolutely impossible. There was something completely wrong. And it's crippling not only because it cripples you, because you are, I was found watching starving children on TV, Biafra, just in floods of tears at like 5 years old. I mean, it not only fills your head with these desperate, you feel this terrible hunger or whatever that you're watching, but you can't act.
Exactly.
You can't act.
Exactly.
For the Romans, what they did was they distinguished between compatio, a bit soppy, actually, even compassion. It's a bit soppy and unmanly, like everybody's got to stand up and take their own pain. But mercy, that is the distinction they made, that the emperor can feel mercy without unmanning himself. So he, from his great position of power, can commute a sentence. That is not compassion, though. Compassion, they found a bit dodgy, because we're all supposed to stand up and take responsibility for our own suffering or something. So this is actually intensely culturally variable, I think. And I think this distinction between empathy, which is terribly praised in women, especially, again, gendered, it's terribly praised, but it's actually really very, very dangerous, because it allows suffering to be contaminating. So this is a huge progress, guys. One of the few I cannot get out of Aristotle.
So I want to go to our audience in just a few minutes, but before I do that, I'm wondering if there are some takeaways that each of you would offer that we could, how do we be happier? How do we increase our well-being? How do we become better people? Maybe small things that we could do in daily practice. Dacher, any suggestions here?
Well, I think that the cultivation of well-being, we've talked a bit about, the various themes we've talked about are all, as Richie said, things that you can do, right? A little bit of meditation, a little bit of walking outdoors, more social conversation, cultivating states like compassion, all good for you. But I want to highlight something that I think is often undervalued that came out of Edith's observations, which is togetherness in appreciating culture, right? A conversation like tonight, taking in the theater, taking in music. The happiness literature tends to focus on the individual, and we lose sight of all the rich cultural forms that get us to the deeper form of happiness. And I think your theater example is right on, which is we gain these insights through music or contemplation or spiritual practice or theater that are part of our pursuit of happiness.
Well, and that's really interesting now that we've been through almost 3 years of COVID, when we've been largely isolated, and we sort of have gotten out of practice of doing things.
And the technologies are undermining it, right? Zoom theater, or, it's like, give me a break, it's like, so, or Zoom, mosh pits.
Absolutely.
Or whatever it is. It's a joke. So let's get back to togetherness.
Yeah.
So.
Richie, what are some of your takeaways?
Yeah, well, first, I very much love what my dear friend Dacher has said. I think for me, what's most important is being intentional about the practice and having some regularity of practice. And one of the things that I also often say is that one size is not going to fit all.
Yeah.
So it's really important that each person find the kind of ingredients that are right for that person. But then once you sort of identify that, stick with it. And stick with it every single day. One of the things that I do, I meditate every day, and then after I meditate, I do this little practice virtually every day where I live a crazy busy life and meeting lots of different people, and I take out my calendar and I spend not more than about 2 minutes just going through each appointment and bringing the people that I'm going to be meeting into my mind and my heart, and simply doing a little appreciation practice for who they are, even if I don't really know them, just imagining what they may be like. And that is something that really is an elixir for the soul and can be enormously helpful. And those kind of little practices that we can insert in our everyday life, I think, are really important.
Edith, what suggestions do you have for us?
Well, I took my breath in when you said intentionality, because that's going to be my word too, but it's rather different. And it is also deeply Aristotelian. He's very deathbed focused, as all the ancient Greeks were. Call no man happy till he's dead. It's all about looking back, like Ivan Desinovich on your deathbed. Whatever mistakes you've made, if you can honestly look yourself in the mirror and say, my intention was good, and altruistic, I intended to do good, then you'll be fine on your deathbed. I'm sorry. I genuinely believe this. Aristotle is incredibly clear about this, that you can deliberate and deliberate and deliberate and still take what turns out to have been the wrong decision because of bad luck, whatever. But if you know you really tried hard, and there, when I think so much of life we have to act on the hoof, we're under pressure, we're fast, in how we have to do anything. What I always come back to all the time is, what is it? What was I trying to achieve with this? Whatever it was, right? And this got very hectic with my own family a few years ago. It's not a wedding. The fights that went on around what was going to happen at the wedding, who was going to be there, what the costumes were going to be like, blah. Everybody seemed to have forgotten that the intention was to come together to celebrate the fact that these two people loved each other, right? Everybody, so get down, what am I trying to achieve both on this particular thing, whatever it is, why am I here tonight, right? And in my whole life, what is it that I want to achieve in my life? So I come back to, what is it am I trying to do all the time? And I think that has really helped. And it certainly helped me with the 2 or 3 really big mistakes where I avoid real guilt, actually, because I can remember my reasoning and that I was trying to do something altruistic with someone, and it simply turned out to be misjudged or something. So I haven't made very many mistakes where I genuinely think I was being a cow. Right.
Okay, well, I'm willing to bet
Nothing wrong with
that
cows.
this has sparked some questions or some comments from our audience. So,
I think that the culture of individualism is clear, and I think it presents certain opportunities for happiness, but important constraints upon it. There's epidemic loneliness in the United States. 40% of Americans feel lonely. They don't have enough social contact in the most individualistic culture in the world. So I think
terrible.
that's something that's front in our attention. Complexity is interesting, and I think that you can apply that to what the digital media are doing to our sense of attention, which is the kind of the influx of images and the lack of coherent structure to what young people face is a new kind of complexity in how they perceive the world. And the data are clear on that it's not a huge effect upon unhappiness, but it's undermining well-being. And so those are 2 examples of how we've perhaps gotten too complex in the information we face and individualism.
so that's interesting. So there is data out that the more people use, let's say, social media, the unhappier they are?
It's largely correlational. It's large studies. The UK has a couple of big studies out, and it's not a big effect, right? And it's going to vary depending on individuals, but it's, on balance, a little bit negative for happiness. It's a really important question. Emotions are often most typically mixing awe and horror in your example, but it's true of most emotions. They're much more complicated than language would suggest. But awe is about, and I hate to talk like this, but 24% of all experiences have dread in them, or threat, that's true. About a quarter of them in our studies worldwide. And they can move you into the state of horror and terror, of alienation, different kind of physiological pattern with some awe mixed in. And I think they awe flips to horror when, to your observation, you can't figure out the intention or meaning of what's happening in the context, and then the sense of real peril, right? The more benign, positive forms of awe have less peril in them. So it's a great kind of space where it can move from one to the other, but you can pull them apart. So.
I'll say something about fear in general. I think that one of the things that has changed over the last maybe couple of decades, and in large part through the amplification that's occurred through the internet and digital media, is the activation of fear. And I think that we are living at a time when the forces of fear and the forces of love are in this kind of epic struggle. We know from neuroscience that fear literally contracts awareness. It constricts the aperture of awareness, so that we literally become less aware of the perceptual field. And that's been demonstrated time and again in really sophisticated, rigorous kinds of research. And so this is really, I think, a huge challenge for us as a developed culture today. And we're not going to get rid of the digital technology. And so I think that one of the moral imperatives of, and one of the reasons why people like me have become what I talk about as an activist scientist, is for this reason. We know how to teach our children to not respond in a fearful way and with signs of threat to all of these stimuli to which they are bombarded. You know, we are all participating in a grand experiment for which none of us have provided our informed consent.
Do you think fear is contagious? I mean, if we see other people who seem fearful, are we more likely to...
Oh, absolutely. And there's good evidence for that. So it is contagious. And I think that, but again, we have the capacity to learn to change our response to those kinds of events in our environment so that they are not occasions for the elicitation of fear.
Edith?
Just, you said fear of power, and that's what interests me greatly. We are very, very lucky in both Britain and the USA not to be living in political systems where we are all absolutely terrified all the time of saying something out of line. I'm not saying there isn't plenty of fear of establishment figures for certain sectors of the population, but you know, this is so precious. This is just so incredible. It's been so rare in human history. And finally, to make us all feel positive, one of the things that Aristotle talks a very great deal in the Politics about tyranny and what it does, the corrosive effects on everybody's happiness, the sort of demoralization. You might still be able to have some happiness in your house, but everybody's behavior starts to degrade morally. And what he says, though, is one of the greatest things you can do, and I thought about people a lot under the terrifying previous president, is he says the first thing tyrants do is shut down groups of people who get together to talk about intellectual matters in social clubs, right? Which is exactly what people are doing here tonight. He says, provided you keep the glue going, right, that people get together to talk and communicate, the top guys at the top can change power as much as they like. It's the minute that we don't feel we can get together to talk and share these kinds of ideas that they've won, right? So fear of power, you know, if you start to feel that human rights are being infringed more and more, do more of this, right?
Well, I think it's, I'll just say a few words. I'm sure others will say something. It's a really important question. And I don't think there are any simple answers, but I will say that we are actually, in our center, we've been doing some work with police. And I think that there are ways in which we can approach this. And so in the case of police, if we can actually help to reduce their fear, as I said earlier, fear contracts awareness. When fear is present, it's going to compromise decision-making because the perceptual field is literally limited. And so we believe that there are strategies that are really win-win strategies to help police both cultivate their well-being as well as enable them to act in ways which will end up becoming less problematic. Now, of course, that's based on a lot of assumptions and conjectures, but I think we have a moral obligation to try. And then you also brought up the military, and I'll just share with you this crazy experience I had during COVID. One of the calls that I got as a cold call, essentially, asking for help was from the military. There are, in the United States today, there are 22 military suicides every day. We have lost more humans to suicide in the military than we've lost to every war combined since World War II. So there's a lot of suffering that's going on there, and I think that there are ways to reduce that suffering. The other issue is that the qualities that we're talking about, I think, are qualities that are fundamentally, and this, I'm sure, I'd love to hear Edith's comments about this, they are fundamentally core to being a democratic citizen. And one of the folks from the Defense Department that reached out to us said to me, and this is a high official from the DOD, said, one of the reasons why we are still living in a democracy post-January 6th is because of the character of the highest level of the United States military. Yeah. And if the military was corrupt, we'd all be screwed. So I think that this is another issue which is really important. And of course, these are complicated moral issues. I don't mean to minimize their complexity, but I think that there are ways that we can act and actually be of some benefit in the current situation.
Yes, I think this comes back, it's very closely related to what I was saying about intent. We've got a lot of problems that I've been thinking about this a lot, and there's been a lot of discussion in Britain because it turns out that the Metropolitan Police in London, is wholly corrupt, especially when it comes to misogyny, right? Just appalling number of them who actually got records for sexual misadventure. It's just terrible. But I always think, I know it sounds very utopian, but a democratic citizenry needs a police force, right? It needs police people to go around arresting bad guys and keeping law and order. And if they genuinely believe that they are servants of the demos, this is what the Greeks would say, that they are acting as the executive arm of the justice of the people, same with the army, right? The unsavory and unwholesome work, if you're fighting Hitler, causes, and I think this is shown, far less trauma than happened to people, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you know that right is on your side. So the trouble is that I think that very many people join police forces and armies for all the wrong reasons, and they see themselves as opponents of the people. Most police people in Britain definitely do. They don't see themselves, when they, as kind of the person I have hired as a member of the demos to look after me. They do not. They see themselves as somehow opposed to the very people, right? So I think it's a matter of much more deep societal structure that if there's pride in being the executive arm of justice, then you're not going to have the same trauma attached to unsavory tasks.
And I would say those qualities can be cultivated.
Exactly. But I have to admit, my grandfather was a Metropolitan Police Constable, never got promoted because he wouldn't join the Freemasons. Man of total integrity. I mean, absolutely cut crystal, took his job incredibly seriously. Actually was on the Westminster beat and stood outside. He's in photographs with Churchill going in and out because he was on the... But through the war, was so proud of the work he'd done to help keep London safe during the Second World War. He would be turning in his grave if he knew that last week somebody was sent down from the Metropolitan Police for 84 charges of rape. I mean, that was on women who'd gone to him for help.
I think you're pointing to something super important. When we meditate and cultivate well-being, we put our butts on the cushion, we're not doing it primarily for ourselves. We literally and explicitly evoke the intention that I'm doing this for others, that this is actually a radical act of generosity, recognizing that calming my mind and opening my heart is beneficial not only for myself, but really it's of primary benefit for all the others with whom we interact. And so it's invoking that intention is so vitally important. And I also want to mention and you were alluding to it, the multiple crises that we're facing. One of them, of course, is climate change. And one of the dangers of presenting the evidence about climate change to our kids is that they become hopeless in the face of these data. And it's really important to provide a sense of agency and a sense of optimism. When Martin Luther King gave his famous speech in Washington, the title was not "I Have a Nightmare." Having a dream about a different way of being is so important.
Yeah, I mean, I signaled that at the outset, and that's a terrific question. I also like, as Richie did, the earlier observation that maybe certain ideologies of happiness and what we've heard tonight does have a very deep Western set of roots, may be problematic for the environment. And there's new data coming out that suggests that happier countries consume more and emit higher carbon emissions and like. So that's worrisome and suggests we need new conceptualizations. And I would push that in a couple of directions. And one is we have thought of happiness as bounded within the individual, and that's just not true scientifically. All experiences are shared and spread and are contagious, so we got to think conceptually about that, and I think your critique of individualism was pointing to that. And then, it is woeful that we don't think of our relationality to the environment, as you're saying, as part of happiness. I don't see that anywhere in the literature, and that's why we need new voices, so it's on the horizon.
Just very quickly, I know people think that I keep saying that Aristotle was the first to do everything, but you know what? He is the very first ancient Greek to say humans have rendered a species extinct. It is the red scallop of the lake on Lesbos, right, because of over-dredging. And he says it's incredibly sad there is no longer a red scallop because we just dredged it too much. He also says that the woods are getting chopped down too much. He should know because the Macedonians were completely denuding the Balkans to build their fleet. And he said we need forest wardens to make sure that for every tree that's chopped down, we plant a new one.
Okay, we have reached the end here. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you.